Welcome to the inaugural Ohio State University Department of History Ottoman and Turkish Lecture. I'm Scott Levi, and I am both department chair and a member of the field that is very happily hosting this new lecture series, one that I hope will soon become a permanently endowed fixture in the department's intellectual life. The study of Ottoman and Turkish history has a very long and distinguished history at Ohio State. Professor Sidney Fisher introduced the teaching of Ottoman history to OSU already in 1935. To provide a bit of context, after more than 6 centuries of existence, the Ottoman Empire itself had come to an end only 13 years before Professor Fisher began teaching its history here. I cannot claim that our program is the oldest in the country, but I can state with both confidence and pride that there are very, very few programs in Ottoman and Turkish history that can match ours in terms of graduate training, graduate placement, and overall scholarly contribution. We hope to be searching soon for a new colleague to fill the Finley Professorship in Ottoman and Turkish history, with that person working alongside my colleague Jane Hathaway, who was last year named both Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor and University Distinguished Scholar. We're poised to remain an exceptional center for Ottoman and Turkish history well into the future. Before we begin, there are a number of people that I'd like to thank. First are the many friends of the program who over the years have contributed to the multiple endowment funds that help support our students' language study and research abroad. To all of you, your generosity is much appreciated. More specifically related to this lecture, I would like to thank our emeritus colleague Carter Findley and his wife Lucia for their support, and also Mr. Serdar Tufekci, CEO of Engie and Ohio State Energy Partners, for selecting our program as one worthy of support. Mr. Tufekci is unfortunately out of town today, and so he can't be with us, but nevertheless, please join me in a round of applause to recognize all of our benefactors. I would also like to thank Rhonda Maynard and Jane Hathaway for their considerable effort and attention to detail in making today's event possible. There is a substantial amount of work that goes into organizing an event such as this. And I am personally grateful to both of you for everything that you put into it. So let's give them a round of applause as well. Now finally, I'd like to note that Jane has already enlisted Professor Nukat Varlik of Rutgers University to deliver the next Ottoman and Turkish lecture this coming spring, March 5th. Mark your calendars. But I'll be in touch again with details as the date approaches. And so without any further delay, let me pass the podium over to my friend and colleague, Professor Jane Hathaway, who will introduce our speaker for our inaugural Ottoman and Turkish history lecture. Please, Jane.
Thank you, Scott, for that very flattering introduction, and there are still seats up in the front row. Right, as you know, I'm Jane Hathaway. I'm a professor of Ottoman history in this department, and I'm really thrilled that the first Ohio State lecture in Ottoman and Turkish history is going to be given by one of our own, Professor Yucel Yanikdag, who received his Ph.D. here in this department in 2002. He was my emeritus colleague Carter Findley's advisee. I was a second reader on his dissertation. His first book, which was published by Edinburgh University Press in 2013, was really a complete reworking of the dissertation and was published under the title Healing the Nation, Prisoners of War, Medicine, and Nationalism in Turkey, 1914 to 1939. It came out in paperback just about a year and a half after it first appeared, which is a testament to its impact in the field, and the Turkish translation came out in 2014 as well. He has been at the University of Richmond in the history department there since 2006. He is now Associate Professor. And I want to embarrass him by telling a little anecdote. The University of Richmond History Department has a permanent visiting professorship, if such a thing is imaginable. The Douglas Southall Freeman Professorship. They bring someone in every year for a semester. And Yucel encouraged me to apply for it a number of years ago, and so I was at Richmond in 2013 in the spring. And Yucel very graciously hosted me. I can't count the times when I was a guest in his home, and was just warmly welcomed by him, by his wife Cheryl, who's in IT, and by their extraordinary cat. I bring that up really because not only to point out how grateful I am that we have a chance to return the hospitality in some small measure, but also because I was at the Institute when we received I was at the University of Richmond when we received the happy news that Yucel had won a coveted year-long membership at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, one of the world's leading research centers. He had a very good year at the Institute. He was there for a full academic year and created sort of a buzz there, as I understand it, to the extent that a couple of years ago, Professor Thomas Dodman from Columbia, who was at the Institute in 2016-17, gave a talk here. And when I went up to talk to him, he told me that the eminent medievalist, Patrick Geary, who's a permanent member of the Institute's faculty, had told him about Yucel's work. Even though Yucel had been there several years before, and Patrick Geary is a medievalist, not someone intimately concerned with World War I. As cordial and supportive a colleague as he is, I don't think Patrick Geary is easily impressed. So the fact that he remembered Yucel well enough after a few years to speak of him, praise him to this another eminent scholar is quite telling. Lastly, before I actually turn over the floor, I should just point out we're approaching the centenary of the armistice of World War I, so this is a very, very timely topic. And many people forget that the Ottoman Empire was actually a party to World War I. The losing side, true, but not alone on the losing side. So the talk comes from Yucel's ongoing book project, his current book project, tentatively titled The Ottoman Great War, Masculinity, Identity, and Memory, and that his talk is called Sacrifice, Fatalism, in air quotes, Tevekkul, or Tevekkul in Arabic, and Masculinity, Morale and Motivation in the Ottoman First World War. So without further ado, please help me welcome Professor Yucel Yanikdag.
Thank you, Jane, for that very nice introduction, mentioning my cat, which I have to report back to her. Thank you again for inviting me. Thank you, Scott and Rhonda, and everyone who worked to arrange my visit, and also everyone for coming to this talk. So, talking about war, we're going to have to talk about some sort of deep issues, obviously. So the title of my talk, as you see it, is out there. 1 second before I get started. On November 27, 1915, taking advantage of the brief quiet in his own trench sector in Gallipoli, Lieutenant Mehmet Fasih decided to visit his officer friend Agati, likely a Syrian Arab, judging from his name, in a nearby sector. He found Agati deeply distressed because the previous night's probe into enemy trenches had been a complete failure. Agati explained that some of the men selected for the mission hesitated when it was time to move into no man's land. Though they tried prodding the hesitating men with bayonets, some of them refused to emerge from the trench and even started to cry like women. Those who did go suffered heavily from enemy fire. Having been told to try again, in Mehmet Fasih's presence, Agati ordered his sergeants to select 40 men and have one sergeant lead them. Sometime later, one of the sergeants came into Agati's dugout, where Mehmet Fasih was still present, to announce that they were able to pick 40 men, but no sergeant, including himself, would volunteer for the mission. Seeing that Agati was just as unnerved as his men, Mehmet Fasih intervened, and he wrote in his diary, "I asked the sergeant how many times he has been called to arms. 6 times, he said. I told him that he is alive because the time decreed by his fate for his death has not yet come. Surely, I said, his father's spirit is watching over him as well. I asked him how he will be able to face the womenfolk and everyone else if he returns with the reputation of a coward. I told him that if they continued to behave in this way, I would make a point of exposing them, not only the sergeant, but other sergeants, to everyone in our hometown of Mersin. So it turned out that since this was one of the earlier battles of World War I, a good number of the men, at least in this unit, had come from the same hometown. In order to manage the sergeant's fear and motivate him, Mehmet Fasih appealed to three notions. The first was fatalism, or Tevekkul. Also encountered among European soldiers, this was the idea that if a bullet carried one's name, there was no way of escaping it. Second is the notion that the sergeants assumed warrior ancestors who had sacrificed themselves by spilling their blood for the same land were both watching over and judging him. His father became the symbol of sacrifice, bravery, and manliness. And finally, the suggestion that he was failing in his manly duty to defend the womenfolk. Direct and even crude as he might have been, Mehmet Fasih was simply trying to motivate the sergeant both by reminding him that he would die only if his time came, and by invoking the concept of manliness, which was understood as the opposite of cowardliness. Towards the end of the war, a young officer fighting on the Eastern Anatolian front, Şevket Süreyya, whose picture is there in his later years, recorded that, quote, he struggled with his soldiers who did not mentally identify with the war, end quote. A convinced nationalist himself, he was frustrated because while his soldiers fought on bravely, they reportedly did not know whether they were fighting to defend their religion, their nation, homeland, or something else. Another officer, Hüseyin Hakkı, shared in a pre-war publication an even lower opinion of the soldiers' worldview. Quote, these poor soldiers, when necessary, give up their lives for the protection of their honor. So the Turkish word here is namus, and I'll explain the context of that in a little bit. But they do not understand what it is they really die for. For them, the fatherland consists of their own fields and nation of their village, end quote. Concerned as he was, Hüseyin Hakkı wrote tracts meant to be used to motivate soldiers. While Şevket Süreyya at first expected his ethnic Turkish soldiers, which he claims they were in his unit, to share his dream of liberating the land of Turan, or the ancestral land of Turks, in Central Asia, Hüseyin Hakkı assumed the worst about the same group of people. The truth was probably somewhere in the middle. Still, the question of how do you motivate an illiterate group of men to put their lives on the line for ideals that they may or may not understand. For some scholars, the Ottoman Empire was the most anachronistic of the belligerents of the First World War. A pre-industrial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire was fighting for its survival in an industrialized war. While many thought that it could be knocked out easily or that it would not last beyond a year or two, the empire fought on, though it was battered beyond recognition by the end. This afternoon, as part of the question of what motivated the men to fight, I will explore the themes referenced by Mehmet Fasih. These are the notions of sacrifice, fatalism, and manliness. I do not, of course, suggest by any means that these were the only means of motivating the men and boosting their morale. However, there are several other themes were employed, but the ones that I take up here recur most frequently in what I call motivational literature and ego documents, or first-person narratives. For my sources, I partially rely on the types of booklets and articles produced by men like Hüseyin Hakkı for the purpose of educating, militarizing, masculinizing, and even nationalizing the soldiers. Written by current or retired officers or men of religion, these works attempted to imbue the mostly illiterate men with some new and modern concepts and firm up others already familiar so that the threat of violence was not the only factor keeping them at the front. Before going on further, I must note a couple of things as well. The rate of literacy in the Ottoman Empire around this time, we think, was less than 10%. It was not only that the illiterate peasant soldiers could not write down their experiences and thoughts, but they also could not read the motivational literature produced for them for their training. During the mobilization and war, the Ottoman government instructed village imams or prayer leaders in Anatolia to include similar themes in their Friday sermons, which were meant to target younger men who were not yet conscripted. During the military service or during war, the task fell mostly on subaltern officers. These are junior officers, mostly at the rank of lieutenants, and occasionally on NCOs, and only infrequently to battalion imams or chaplains. Subaltern officers left behind significant sources, which I also employ here. The motivational instructions were delivered as lectures in various forms to the illiterate men as conditions allowed, even during wartime. Both the authors of such literature and the officers in charge of training the men believed in the larger utility of these motivational lessons well beyond military service. Influenced by the German work, The Nation in Arms, Ottoman officers claimed to see the military as the nation's common classroom for the masses of illiterate peasants. As men were called to arms, officers would not only impart them with motivation for battle, but also nationalize them through lessons on their nation, empire, history, religion, and even hygiene. Therefore, whether they lectured them on motivation, cowardice as the opposite of manliness, or on their nation, the intention was to create new subjects through education and discipline. The men were introduced to modern concepts of national identity and civic duty. However, the military authorities and officers also took advantage of the kinds of traditional religious or patriarchal beliefs already present among the men to motivate them for battle as well. In other words, the Ottoman military training attempted to modernize the men without necessarily undermining those traditional sources of identity and motivation. In the Ottoman military, soldiers were referred to as efrad, the plural form of the Arabic word for individual. Thus, in the Ottoman context, efrad meant both soldiers and individuals. This dual meaning helped one motivational literature writer demonstrate the long-term aim of the instructions with a play on words. According to him, proper moral and social preparation during military service would assure that first, individuals of the military, that is efrad, and eventually individuals of the nation, also efrad, would come to possess common ideas and causes. The easy switch from soldiers to individuals of the nation was meant to evoke the concept of the military nation as proposed in The Nation in Arms. In militarist and practical terms, this meant that in time of need, every individual was a soldier. Or put differently by the author of the same piece, quote, "There is no difference between those who perform their duty and those who are always ready to perform it," end quote. If the myth that the Turks were a military nation found its fuller development in the nationalist narrative of the 1930s, its origins can certainly be traced to the late empire and certainly to this period. Especially during times of war, Ottoman military made extensive use of the notion of sacrifice, which we might define as a set of concepts commanding the virtue of laying down one's life for a greater cause. Also employed in Europe, such a notion represented the act of dying for a greater cause as a sacred undertaking. What the men were asked to sacrifice themselves for might have differed somewhat from England and France to the Ottoman Empire, but the notion of sacrifice as such seems remarkably similar. Before we look at what these greater causes were for the Ottomans, let us have a closer look at how such notions were communicated to the men given their overwhelming illiteracy. Though what the officers called counseling, or lecturing, I guess we can more properly call it, was also frequently employed, another common instructional method required the soldiers' active cooperation by providing memorized answers to brief questions asked by their officers. very much like learning by rote, these questions were designed to elicit standard or canned responses. Writers believed that illiterate men would best learn in this way since it allowed them to memorize through repetition. Nearly all motivational literature writers noted that lessons offered and questions asked of the illiterate men should be, quote, short and simple. Obviously, they didn't think very highly of them. And in the plainest language possible to increase the chances of imitation and suggestion, taqlid and telqin, through repetition. As the following brief example of an answer question lesson demonstrates, the duty to defend the fatherland was presented as an obligation with religious connotations owed to the state, fatherland, nation, martyred ancestors, and even future generations. Quote, one of the questions coming up here, what is necessary to eat halal bread? One question asked, but the answer was not about living an honest, pious, or ethical life as it would be normally. Soldiers were to respond, quote, one must serve the fatherland with utmost loyalty, end quote. Another question followed. I have a few questions here. What happens to those who do not eat halal bread? The answer suddenly involved both the soldier and his children, for such a person, quote, would be considered a scoundrel, a thief, a degenerate, and his children would be good-for-nothing base characters, end quote. Another question provided a solution to this problem. Quote, who are the most precious and important children of the village, end quote. Of course, they were, quote again, children of the wounded warriors, grandchildren of martyrs, especially if they have martyrs in their family for a few generations, end quote. Although reminding a front soldier about his children might not be the best idea, I think it was also an opportunity to put the men at ease about leaving family behind in case of the ultimate sacrifice. The next question asks, who would take care of a martyr's orphans if he died? End quote. The answer noted that, quote, again, a martyr's children would not be considered orphans because the whole nation would adopt them, end quote. That is, they would become the nation's children, the nation the soldier reportedly did not know upon enlistment, according to many of the officers. Just to make sure I'm on the right track here. Authors and subaltern officers firmly believed in the utility of history lessons as a motivational tool as well. Featuring stories of noteworthy Ottoman military feats and heroes, brief history lessons emphasize the bravery and sacrifices of Ottoman soldiers from the highest to the lowest ranks. In fact, some even reached back to the time of the Prophet and pointed him out as an exemplar in war. However, since the late 19th century, and I think this is also the case in Europe, the lionization of ordinary men as martyrs for the fatherland was certainly on the rise. The Battle of Gallipoli alone produced a number of such examples. Sergeant Mehmet, who held off a large enemy landing force with only a few dozen men, long enough for reinforcements to arrive, is the most famous of these. This same Sergeant Mehmet, who died along with all of his men, was the son of certain Sergeant Veli, who had very similarly distinguished himself in the Balkan Wars in 1912 and 13. Such genealogy of bravery and martyrdom was important for a few reasons. The glorification of relatively ordinary men made it possible for the listener to imagine himself in the same role. As one officer put it, such stories needed to demonstrate, quote, the wonderful qualities of our conquering might, courageousness, and bravery by appealing to the taste of and exciting the spirits of soldiers, end quote. These stories not only suggested that the soldiers behaved just as selflessly in battle, but also reminded the men that, quote, every corner of the fatherland had been soaked by the blood of their ancestors, end quote. Failing to defend these same lands would offend the sacrifices of past generations for the fatherland. When telling Agassi's much reluctant sergeant that his father's spirit was watching over and judging him, Mehmet Fasih was referring to this very idea. Combined with the idea of military nation, or discourse or narrative of military nation, such reminders about the sacrifices of one's ancestors likely encouraged men to invest emotionally in similar warrior identity. Naturally, all works about motivation in war give a significant role to religion. Recognizing the military utility of a non-military Islamic religious concept, especially that of Sufism, most point to the special importance of fatalism or Tevekkul, or putting one's trust in God or depending upon Him. One writer asked, quote, "Isn't fatalism the most respectable and courageous consolation for the members of the military who suffer from various forms of deprivation, misery, and dreadful disasters during times of war," end quote. Seeing deprivations and disaster as part of God's plan and testing of human beings was meant to offer a sense of consolation because tomorrow might bring something different, and any attempt to change it would be futile and resistance to God's will. Another wrote, quote, "When human beings find themselves in dangerous situation, they always think of death and mortality. As the moment of death is unknown, they have no choice but to completely surrender to this mysterious power," end quote. Key to fatalism was the notion of surrender or resignation and being safe through acceptance of divine will. In order to overcome the fear of suffering and death, the soldier needed to resign himself to God's will by trusting Him. This would ideally lead to a state of tranquility through acceptance of destiny. Promoting fatalism offered some hope to soldiers. Instead of believing just before an attack that death was inescapable, they could also feel some hope that they would die only if God had determined it in that way. And since there was nothing else they could do about their fate, soldiers would not run away but stand their ground, or so it was believed. At the same time, the better educated and more secular of the subaltern officers found themselves in a bind over the notion of fatalism. They appreciated the military utility of Tevekkul in times, or fatalism, among illiterate men, but also feared its possible dangers beyond military service for the nation at large. They believed that such notions were misinterpreted, abused, and taken to the extreme by minimally educated village prayer leaders or other men of religion to promote a deep sense of fatalism and otherworldliness among peasants. Unquestioned acceptance of such teachings and otherworldly thinking undermine, in their mind, what should be the peasants' more natural desire to work for material progress to improve their lives and that of the fatherland for which they were asked to sacrifice themselves. These manuals also attempted to impart sentiments of stoic endurance, emotional expression, and forbearance of pain and hardship. These are translated terms, so it might sound a little awkward, but I try to remain true to my sources there. One of these works, called Nation and Military Service, suggested proper behavior through imitation. Block quotation here. "Stoic and enduring soldiers won't get confused during most bloody, most dim times of warfare. Such soldiers would say, martyrdom is fame, being wounded is dignity, and not lose their fortitude. They would not turn away from the enemy. These temperaments are like a citadel that will never collapse. They are like a bulletproof fortification," end quote. Ideas in this type of literature were derived from the thoughts of military officials, men of religion, and as such, they're about ideology and expectations rather than experience. In other words, these normative statements did not necessarily determine behavior, and expectations expressed in them should not be taken as evidence of subjectivity. Now, by turning again to the first-person narratives, I will take a look at sacrifice and fatalism to see how these notions were experienced and reflected in the self-perceptions of the men who fought. I mentioned that officers delivered lessons in the manuals to the soldiers as time and training allowed. Unfortunately, given the lack of literacy among the peasant soldiers, it's nearly impossible to consider the reception and internalization of these lessons directly from their experience. However, we're lucky enough to have a few memoirs of enlisted men who wrote about these issues. Supplementing these with diaries, memoirs of officers and officer candidates, essays and poems appearing in troop newspapers, we can arrive at a relatively good profile of the enlisted men's experience. Admittedly, the most relevant example of an enlisted men's memoir is somewhat exceptional as well. It was not written by an average soldier who could barely read or write, but by a graduate of a high madrasa, or Islamic university, named Abdullah Fevzi, who came from the town of Konya in central Anatolia. And like Mehmet Fasih, Abdullah Fevzi served in Gallipoli. Because he initially did not mention his education, he says intentionally, Abdullah Fevzi served as an enlisted man, but at some point, for various reasons, the life of a front soldier proved too much for him. And at that point, he notified his commanding officer of his religious and educational qualifications, and he was immediately made the battalion imam or chaplain. Abdullah Fevzi disagreed with his own officers, how his own officers attempted to motivate soldiers. He thought that because of the limited horizons of the illiterate soldiers, asking them to defend the fatherland was not an effective motivation. He was sure that the idea of fatherland was too abstract for these soldiers. Because he believed that the soldiers regionally identified themselves, they could not imagine that all parts of the empire were part of the fatherland in the larger sense. Put differently, a soldier from eastern Anatolia could not understand what a loss in Gallipoli in northwestern Anatolia or Thrace would mean for him. The fatherland was behind the soldier, he said, but a likely death was in front of him. Observing that soldiers frequently became, quote, as quiet as an out-of-steam train, end quote, just prior to an attack out of fear of death, he suggested that such secular notions were not enough to motivate on their own to calm the fears and motivate the men to charge into the enemy trenches. He noted that when soldiers realized that they might not see their families again, they asked God to spare their lives for the sake of their children. Abdullah Fevzi concluded that the mention of fatherland families had been distractions. They would only encourage desertion rather than sacrifice, in his opinion. Instead, he suggested, men should be told that they were fighting to defend Islam and God's blessing awaited them in case of death. As the battalion imam, he could have lectured the men and lead them into the no man's land, but there is no indication that he ever did. Captain Sokrat Efendi, a Greek Orthodox Ottoman officer, wrote that in Gallipoli, I chose all my examples from Gallipoli, he motivated men under his command by talking to them about his experiences in the Balkan Wars, families of the soldiers left behind at home, and the urgency of pushing the enemy into the sea to rescue the fatherland. The same land had been the fatherland of Sokrat Efendi's ancestors much longer than that of his Muslim soldiers. Sokrat Efendi avoided religious themes for obvious reasons, yet for him and his soldiers, the idea of defending the fatherland and the families left behind seems to have been enough. Can we confirm or challenge Abdullah Fevzi's observers, what he observed in other ways? Luckily, and I'm going to confuse you a little bit because another person with the middle name of Fevzi here, luckily Mustafa Fevzi, also from the same town of Konya, was in Gallipoli. He was also a madrasa graduate, but of a different type when compared to Abdullah Fevzi. Mustafa Fevzi was put in charge of a unit of men as sergeant major. He sometimes wrote in the first person plural to describe the emotions in his unit, especially during challenging times. While religious notions are not absent at all from his memoir, Mustafa Fevzi clearly preferred to highlight the defense of the fatherland as the motivation for fighting the war. Almost as if to answer Abdullah Fevzi's observation that a soldier from the east would not know what a loss in Gallipoli would mean, Mustafa Fevzi wrote, quote, we all knew we were at the main gate of our fatherland. A loss here meant the loss of Istanbul. Because of this, we continuously charged the enemy, end quote. Perhaps the peasant soldiers could identify with Istanbul, if not with Gallipoli. Of course, it is possible that not everyone understood or internalized the lessons about sacrifice and fatherland, but those who did, these sentiments stayed with them for a while, even if they were no longer combatants. The following lines from a poem by an Ottoman prisoner of war brings together some of the motivational themes I already noted. He wrote, "When the battlefield was still aflame, bayonets and lances were raised. Like a hot burning fire, a soldier yelled out from his trench, sounding like an exploding shell. When the fatherland is being attacked, I cannot sit still. My father's soul, I'm sure, looks down upon me. For I'm the son of a martyr, I cannot change my fate." It is all there, fatherland and martyred ancestors and fatalism. While Abdullah Fevzi may have complained about the absence of religious themes at the front, motivational literature and other memoirs, letters written by commanding officers to parents of dead soldiers, and troop newspapers tell us a slightly different story. I would like to turn to the third motion that Mehmet Fassi appealed in order to motivate the sergeant. He threatened to expose him as a coward before the woman folk and everyone else. And what did he mean exactly? Scholars working on the Great War in Europe have argued that identities men gained through war experience were implicitly gendered, for war was a sphere of masculine attainment. In the case of the Ottoman Empire, or later Turkish Republic, military service, even without war experience, was explicitly gendering, for it was constructed as a rite of passage from boyhood to manhood. Historical scholarship on Ottoman Turkish masculinities has focused on two related themes. The first examines the Republican myth of the military nation, as I referred to before, which suggests that Turks have always been a courageous military nation and that every Turk is a born soldier. The second trend has focused on paramilitary youth organizations created in 1912 and 13, which were based largely on the Boy Scout model. Coming after the major defeat in the Balkan Wars, sort of in this sense connected the Boer War in England when these movements started, paramilitary training was to create masculinized, militarized, and nationalized young boys ready to be turned into real men by military service. These boys needed to be strengthened with the natural qualities of, quote, manliness and bravery. While you don't need to read that text, just see, you can't read it even, in fact, I can't read it. But while the motivational publications put significant emphasis on men's roles as protectors and defenders of women, some also include women in active roles. One of them refers to Kara Fatma, or Black Fatma, Fatma being the name here, who was supposed to have played an important role in the defense of Erzurum in eastern Anatolia in the 1877-78 Russo-Turkish War. As the town was besieged, Kara Fatma helped the wounded, but at some point the town's redoubt was captured by the enemy. At that crucial moment, Kara Fatma gathered, quote, the elderly and the children and armed them to fight to drive back the enemy. Thus saving the city, Kara Fatma became the female lion, in quotes, for one of the writers who also asked, quote, if a female Ottoman behaves like this, how would a male Ottoman behave, end quote. The answer was also ready, like a male lion. I suggest that the story about Kara Fatma does not actually threaten gender dichotomy, but reaffirms it. War was men's work, since one of their duties was to defend the sexual honor, or namus in Turkish, of their womenfolk. The story was a reminder that the men had almost failed in this case, which led to Fatma having to defend her own honor. And a few words are in order here about honor, or namus, as well. Though sometimes translated as virtue or honor, namus refers to both the sexual integrity of the female family members and a man's ability to provide for and defend his house, his female relations in particular, against threats from the outside world. One who could not or would not defend his honor was simply namussuz, or one without honor. And someone without honor was not a masculine man at all. The lesson was that, as good as the exceptional Kara Fatma was, men simply needed to do better. They needed to be courageous defenders of not only to protect the honor of their woman, but also to rescue the honor of manliness away from transgressing woman. A recent work on mobilization revealed that the concept of honor was a useful tool in recruitment as well. The recruits were told that the enemy constituted a threat to the honor and chastity of Ottoman woman, which needed to be defended. As we see with Kara Fatma's story, the motivational pieces did the same thing, but some took it even further to connect female sexual honor to the honor of the fatherland. In their lessons, men were asked, quote, what is the relationship between the fatherland and the nation? Their answer was to be, quote, fatherland is the nation's mother and fatherland is nation's soul, end quote. When the men were asked, quote, what happens if the enemy touches your fatherland, end quote, they were to answer, quote, its chastity, or namus, would be ruined and my heart would sink, end quote. In this way, the fatherland, now feminized, depended on the protection and sacrifice of men and their sense of honor. Was a man who refused to protect the namus or honor of his womanfolk and that of the fatherland still a man? The Sergeant Mehmet Fasih chastised at the beginning of my talk listened to the visiting lieutenant had to say and went on to the probing mission that night. Clearly, fear of death had undermined all the motivational reserves of the anonymous sergeant. What convinced or motivated him, we don't know. Perhaps he was not even convinced at all, but realized that he had no other choice. Yet, at that moment, what mattered was that he went on the mission. Motivational literature reminded the men that masculinity was about courage, stoic endurance, emotional expression, and forbearance of pain and hardship. Courage means manliness. Soldiering means manliness. Dignity of manliness depends on one's ability to have forbearance in the face of all kinds of challenges and difficulties and to remain firm in purpose, end quote. These works have very little to say about dealing with fear, which chipped away at the motivation and morale of soldiers. A few works simply suggest, quote, when fighting begins, throw off your fear. Be forbearing in the face of terrifying experiences of war, end quote. Obviously, as the sergeant would agree, it was easier said than done. One subaltern who faithfully recorded in his diary numerous and surprisingly detailed scenes of death and destruction always followed them with comments like, quote, this scene unnerved me immensely, or my emotional and nervous situation keeps getting worse, and I cannot stand it any longer. My heart is extremely bothered. One night, as he tried to catch a few hours of sleep in his dugout, he noticed that small chunks of earth was falling on him from the roof of his shelter. So the dugout is basically a handmade cave in the trench. As the fear of being buried alive in trench or dugout collapses set in once again, he wrote, quote, I am very nearly a coward, end quote. This was none other than Mehmet Fasih himself, the one who chastised the sergeant. What did he do? He turned, and in fact he actually, he doesn't have a bed, it's just a small cot. Just turns over, he says, Tevekkul. It was not, he turned to fatalism to comfort himself, and perhaps it was still not his time, he told himself. And this was not the first time, and would not be the last time he practiced what he suggested to the sergeant. Some scholars studying the Great War in Europe have suggested that while providing moments of comfort, in the long run, fatalism might have undermined the men's sense of masculinity by denying them control over their own fates. They submit that by revealing their utter powerlessness in the face of death, it eroded all those things which were supposed to define them as men. Day by day, they became little less courageous, a little less stoic, a little less able to express fear and emotions, a little less able to forbear pain and hardship. Yet other scholars argue that the fact the fighting men were willing to endure terrible conditions for 4 years or longer in the case of Europe suggests that these notions or ideologies, as they called them, held significant importance as motivational factors. Surely, some men probably found no glory in sacrificing for the fatherland, religion, masculinity, or honor. These notions were simply not convincing enough for some to overcome their fear of death. Perhaps a minority did not even understand them properly, as a few of the officers claimed. But it seems that for the larger number of Ottoman soldiers and subalterns, the notion of sacrifice provided a means by which death in wartime was rendered less horrifying when seen as martyrdom. This was the same in Europe for the most part. Some European scholars have argued that from a nationalist perspective, dying in war was a regenerative act that would give life to the nation. The precise idea was highlighted in an Ottoman journal in 1914. Quote, "We run to the fields of battle where we kill and die. Fortunate is the nation, and happy is the soldier of that nation who willingly sacrifices himself in a manly manner for religion and fatherland so that the nation may live." End quote. Along the same lines, we might suggest that from the fighting men's perspective, martyrdom also offered the spiritual regeneration of the warriors or the warrior in paradise. In fact, in the same way, the survivors remember the comrades, in fact, this is the same way the survivors remember the comrades they lost. They were, quote, the glorious dead, or, quote, living martyrs, both in Europe and in the Ottoman Empire. Throughout the war, they continued to interpret the deaths of their comrades as worthy sacrifices. Of course, they also hoped secretly that that is how their own deaths would be remembered in case of fate caught up with them. These sacrifices were followed by the survivors promising to avenge the deaths of their comrades. So some people argue that it's that need for revenge is what also motivated them. Personal narratives, and especially diaries and letters of the front soldiers, provide a check on the hard-aged expectations of the motivational literature, or on the words of the likes of Abdullah Fevzi, who suggested that men must be indoctrinated with the notion of martyrdom while he chose the safety of being a battalion imam. Surely, men fought for a variety of, or a combination of reasons. Perhaps this is why both the motivational literature and the words of Mehmet Fassi touched on a number of themes in order to motivate Sargent. Even as they wrote about brutality of war and their extreme suffering, many soldiers and officers kept coming back to sacrifice and fatalism in their ego documents. In many ways, the suffering they experienced gave greater meaning to the sacrifice. We can also say, at this point only tentatively from Ottoman history perspective, since my research is not yet complete, that their sense of suffering and sacrifice actually came to influence the way they redefine their masculinities as well. Thank you.
Well, my thanks to Professor Yanikdag for that very, very stimulating talk. And we have, how long do we have? About certainly half an hour for questions. Bruno.
Thank you for this wonderful talk and for this introduction to the motivational literature that I didn't know at all. I've been working on one for a long time, and it's really very, very interesting. What strikes me when I see these three notions, fatalism, masculinity, and fatherland, it's exactly the notions that the Anzacs will use as well. And I was wondering if we change the level of study, if you could say something about maybe the kind of influence that the enemy had, seeing the enemy behaving like heroes, you started your lecture with Gallipoli.
Yeah.
Do you think that the attitude of the Anzacs changed at some point, this motivational literature, or the attitude of the soldiers of the Ottoman Empire, or how they felt about masculinity and fatalism and the fatalism?
You mean as a result of the experience of fighting the enemy?
Yes, and also as, definition of yourself in your confrontation
Yeah.
with the enemy.
Well, I mean, motivational literature didn't change because these men were not fighting, the writers. But what we see in the ego narratives,
That there was, there was no feedback from
not that I could detect.
Really?
When they were published republished during the war, and I compared some of them, I'm not going to claim that I compared everything, but it's sometimes easy enough, a publication from 1913 versus 1916, if first few pages looked good enough, I mean, exactly the same, and, words matched, I didn't go on reading every one of them. But I looked at about a dozen of them, and they were exactly the same. So I don't know if this was because, no rewrites occurred, and the government or the military was simply republishing them to distribute them to the soldiers. But I didn't detect any changes in the motivational literature itself. There is change after the war. That's quite different. Partially really starts around 1923, 1924, but also there's a different country at that point. Yeah. And surprisingly enough, for a secular republic, there's a good deal of religion in those motivational literature as well. But even in the late 1920s, they exist. By 1930, psychology comes in for this kind of stuff. But there's certainly a change can be detected, I think, in personal narratives, respect for the enemy, but especially for the Anzacs for some reason. It's their bravery that sort of, on the one hand, impresses them. So, and I think that this is a relatively common notion in the sense that you have to respect the enemy because he's a lethal weapon himself who could easily kill you, right? So I think any kind of dehumanizing of the enemy, at least from the Ottoman sources, I have not encountered at all. I encountered that kind of stuff in prisoner of war narratives because the relationship changed. So prisoner is no longer a combatant, and he's at the mercy of the enemy, who then becomes this demonized, dehumanized soldier.
Because they are dishonored by captivity, or?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's because the relationship changes and the prisoner realizes that I might just be killed on the spot, or that they're mistreated, etc. So the enemy suddenly becomes, even the brave Russian soldier, during the fighting suddenly becomes the bear, the pig, or the whatever. But generally, though, in terms of narratives, there's always respect for the enemy. And sure, a little bit of hate here and there because they're invading one's fatherland. What are you doing here, kind of thing. As I'm answering that, it brings to mind, and I'm teaching a freshman level course on World War I. I gave my students a document to analyze as I came here, and it's actually, I translated it for them. It is when another lieutenant, but in this case, law school graduate, who they see a smoke or fire coming from some part of the peninsula, so they go to check it out, and he's a little behind his soldiers, he can't catch up with them. It turns out that it's a group of about a dozen British officers who had landed in a sort of a reconnaissance mission behind the Ottoman lines to see if they could land. Having landed, they decided to light a fire and make tea. Of course, which attracted the attention of the Ottomans. But before the officer could get there, now I guess in that sort of chaos, Ottoman soldiers thinking this was a major invasion or there are others fighting starts. And because they're outnumbered, almost all of the British officers are killed or dying, basically. And the officer, can't stop his soldiers, but he stops them, maybe to save one or two, and ends up going through their pockets and reads he knows English, reads some of the letters, looks at the pictures, everything. He starts crying in front of his men, right? Then 2 minutes later, he starts cursing them for their stupidity. But even then, that respect is there. You're stupid for not only invading our land, but also making tea during this kind of thing. So, I think it influences, but I'm not sure how sort of detectable it is. And it's certainly for the Anzacs. And I can't really say that so much for, and there are not too many examples of it, fighting the French, for example. British, less so. And I would definitely put the Anzacs in a different category. Even now, there's an identification with Anzacs, how the colonized people were fooled into fighting for the imperialists.
Alam?
Yes, you use terms like taqlid, talqin, tawakkul, afrad, namus. Many of them are Arabic terms, almost all.
Yep.
Turks were warriors much before Islam went to that region. They probably had their own terms for those. I am doing a research on the pre-Islamic military terms in the case of Afghanistan, in Iran, and the subcontinent of India.
Yeah.
What were the original Turkish words for these?
For those very terms?
Yeah, for those.
Before
Are there
Islam?
in a research done that, because the Turkish warriors from, let's take Sultan Mahmud of Ghaznavi, he was in the 10th century, he was a Turk.
Yeah.
So there are these terms that I find pure Farsi words for that. But I do not know how much in Turkish you have.
Pure Turkish words, honestly, I don't know. It's a little out of my time period. But are you also saying pretty Islamic, or as soon as they converted, it came in through Transoxiana?
Yeah, Islam went there in the end of the 7th century and the 8th century. So I'm certain that there were terms that they were using before they
I don't know, but that's a good question. I don't know the answer.
I asked Dennis Sinor if he hadn't passed away, or Peter Golden.
Yeah, right, I was thinking
Yeah,
that exactly.
In terms of looking at the 4th, 5th century Turk Kaghanate, the terminology that's used there, a handful of people working on that in the world. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes, sir. Yeah, you, yeah.
So continuing on perceptions of the enemy, I was curious if in your research you've seen anything on how gender discourses affected perceptions of the internal enemy. So maybe most specifically how Armenians assumed capacity to either weaken or betray the nation was undergirded by certain ideas about gender. Gender ideas were applied differently to different internal ethnic minorities.
Certainly not Armenians, I'm going to say, because one reason for this is many of the non-Muslims they were put into unarmed labor battalions. So there was not exactly a direct and prolonged contact. But we do have some Armenian soldiers who served, and some Armenian officers, especially doctors, but also non-medical personnel. But I haven't encountered anything of that sort. Not to say it didn't happen. They just don't exist in the sources. About Arabs, though, this idea is certainly, there's something to it. Not so much in gendered terms, but if you start calling people cowards, then you start to do that anyway, right? So about Arabs, it's visible. And some of it one can encounter in diaries, more so in memoirs, but I think that's the sort of this belated influence of the nationalist narrative That comes a little bit later because it's the stab in the back that we lost the war because of Arab rebellion. So it's difficult to pinpoint that. I'm trying to remember if, there's very little really in sort of contemporaneous sources, that is to say in diaries, letters, and others, anything that might be sort of gendered about non-Turkish populations. But if I think of it, happily contact you.
Yeah, I see your hand up, Bruno, but yes.
Oh, did the industrialization of war in the First World War contribute to this concept of fatalism? So like, mass artillery and some of the mechanization of war making war appear more random?
From my reading of the European literature, which I will admit is not as wide as European historians might be, I don't remember any connection made in that regard. Some people argue, Jay Winter for example, that the level of industrialization actually maybe, obviously in the case of England in this case, and because many of the soldiers were also workers, factory workers, etc., introduced a certain amount of discipline, which made it perhaps less necessary for these kinds of ideas well, not develop it because it existed. A number of scholars certainly argue for that. But perhaps it was less required in cases like this, because frequently officers thought that if there was more strict discipline, and some of these motivational sort of notions would not be as necessary. Even though from my reading, Germans also resorted to these kinds of things, but that idea of German discipline was supposed to ideally make these kinds of things unnecessary. I know it's sort of not the exact kind of answer, but that's the extent of my knowledge on that. Certainly in the case of the Ottoman Empire, not industrialized at all, so none of these were factors.
Bruno?
Yes, I have another question about the kind of extreme example of the collapse of motivation, or even with masculinity. Does the notion of shell shock make sense in the Ottoman Empire? Is it the notion that is at some point introduced during the war, or does it make sense in the global ideology of the Ottoman Empire?
Yeah, I mean, I worked on this in article and some of it in the book Jane mentioned. So the idea of shell shock, I mean, part of the reason why I mentioned Mehmet Fassi is frequently saying, I lost my nerve, etc. So until I sort of worked on this topic, completely sort of unknown territory, right? Because I think partially in a way, both during the Ottoman Empire, but also during the Turkish Republic, this idea of, Turks being a military nation, I think completely excluded any evidence of any sort of victims of shell shock. But I was able to find some in medical literature only, I mean in specialized medical journals. And briefly referred to it as war neurosis, but hysteria, more likely because that's also what happened in Germany, France, and England as well. The idea that men would break down was obviously seen. I think I'm getting away from your question a little bit. Men were seen, basically, those who broke down as unmanly men, especially when their sort of symptoms came to be diagnosed as hysteria, which obviously was seen as mostly a female malady, though it was masculinized in the 19th century, but there's still this idea that if some men break down, others don't. What is it that distinguishes these men who break down? So following the German model and the British model to a certain extent, the Ottoman psychiatrists basically argued that the men who broke down were men who were already emotionally and psychologically unstable. So the war, this is a militarist argument, war did not cause the problem, it just revealed it, what was already there. So in this sense, there's a good deal of sort of, when we look at obviously shell shock or war neurosis, as they called it, without using gender terms, it's implicit in their narrative, the way they talk about it. So I found some evidence, when they talk about soldiers, they don't sort of, no references to gender, but when the same psychiatrists diagnose men, civilians, with hysteria, it's completely different. So I think this self-censorship, even though they're talking among themselves in specialized medical literature, somehow they avoided, again, it's implicitly there, but only if one reads carefully. So that idea of masculinity there is obviously under a great deal of challenge, right? Especially in the case of the Ottoman Empire, when either because of what happened to the Armenians, but also because of famine, disease, etc., something like 20–25% of the population of Syria dies. Anatolia, in regions, it's up to 30–35% of the population simply disappearing. And in the aftermath of the war, this kind of destruction, on the one hand, on the population, but on the other, the psychiatrist's fear that so many men broke down due to sort of underlying or pre-existing psychological or psychiatric conditions, sends them into this alarm mode. So it's the fear of degeneracy that existed in Europe and France in the late 19th century as a result of the Franco-Prussian War arrives in the Ottoman Empire at that point. And that's when we see the sort of the proliferation, I guess, the worry, the sort of complete fear. And I think the fear was real, even though they also used it to their advantage to obviously sort of carve out important roles for themselves.
Nathan?
So you mentioned some themes such as the martyr motif, the rite of passage in terms of doing military service and whether or not one fights, even how regional affinity and affinities and affiliations take precedent over the fatherland. These things I would say are really alive and well in modern Turkey. So this is maybe moving slightly past World War I, but to what extent did the early framers draw on these elements of social capital, and to what extent were these kind of grassroots things that just progressed as the republic was being established?
Yeah, well, you're right, I agree. It's still prevalent in modern day Turkey, and it's difficult to measure this, especially back 100 years ago, right? So this is definitely the fear of the officers, but not all of them. Certainly Ismail Hakkı felt that way. Şevket Süreyya, in a way, felt that way. But at the same time, they make the argument that in small ways, whether through these lessons or these lectures, that they were able to, in one way or another, at a small measure, obviously, to sort of broaden the worldviews of these enlisted men. Obviously, it's too much of a claim. It's exaggerated too much. But in the absence of more sources from the enlisted men, very difficult for me to measure this. Yeah. One way of doing that is in the first book, again, because you have a control group, or controlled group, I should say. But this is an extraordinary environment of sorts when the men are taken prisoners out of boredom. The officers establish schools in prison camps to educate the men, and they achieve something there. But obviously, the numbers are so small, so the impact is extremely limited in that sense. But there is this great hope. Whatever they learn, and in fact, even these, battlefield lessons too. But there's no way to measure. It's like what you learn here, go tell your, brother, go tell your father, go tell your mother. So to be the ambassador of either the fatherland or whatever you learn, everything from hygiene to actually the idea that you're a Turk. Şevket Süreyya actually is quite frustrated with his soldiers. Carter might remember this because I think he knows this book very, very well. When he asks his soldiers, from what nation are we?
Yeah.
You know this too, yeah. So the idea is, some say we're Turks, some say, Estağfurullah, we're not Turks, we're Muslims. It's a regional kind of answer, because in some places, a Turk is an Alawi Muslim. So, very good question, but I don't have a very good answer to it.
Ben and then Pasha.
I was curious about the intersection of masculinity and these authors of this motivational literature themselves. It seems kind of almost hilariously hypocritical that these people are sitting elsewhere and telling soldiers, why aren't you being brave enough, why aren't you being masculine? I was wondering if there were any instances you found where either soldiers kind of stood up and said, what's this book you're reading us, who's this guy telling us to go be more brave, or if there's any motivational literature writers who, in their own accounts, might have said, what am I doing here, I'm telling people to be brave and I'm sitting elsewhere.
Neither.
Okay.
No, very quick answer to that. Some of the motivational literature writers can be traced. Turks or Ottomans, I should say, starting with Ottomans, and then later into the Republic, did not have last names until 1934-35. So if they continue to publish, you can figure out who people were. Now, I've tried to trace some of them, and I could do that with some, to see if anything changed, and this relates to the question later on. But in some ways, they're reflecting the secularist notions in the Republic. We see other examples of this, not from motivational literature writers, and none of the sort of soldiers complain about this kind of stuff. But people who are in the rear lines when they show up, and they expect that soldiers to behave or act in a certain way, it's their sort of, what's the right word here? Surprise at how difficult the life is. And realization at that point that we I'm gonna say we were talking theoretically, but talking out of place basically. And it's only those people who write about this kind of stuff, and they're not the motivational literature writers, but officers, sometimes doctors in fact, not the psychiatrists, that sort of world of their own. And they're in the capital city, so they're completely removed from this as well. But a little bit of that only in that kind of literature. Again, when we're talking about high rates of illiteracy or very low rate of literacy, sources are not as plentiful as it might be for England or France or Germany.
I wanted to get back to the idea of the depiction of enemies in any sort of motivational literature. There's someone teaching the history of the book in pre-modern times, and in a couple of weeks he's having a lecture.
I'm sorry, history of the
book in the English department.
Okay.
So in a couple of weeks he's having a lecture on motivational literature for military and for religion, and he's asked me to bring in some stuff. We have a modest collection of pamphlets and 1970 to 21. So these are Bolshevik pamphlets.
Okay.
What will the future be? But then you also get the depiction of the White Army in negative terms. So when the illiterate soldiers are being schooled in sort of the positive for the fatherland, for your masculinity and so forth, do they get a profile of the enemy? And I noticed for the posters, it's different, you contrasted with the American viewpoint of women's honor and so forth. But is there anything?
Certainly about the Russians, but very little. Russia was seen as the traditional enemy. I think 11 or 12 wars with Russia during the whole, some victories, some losses, especially in the latter half of the Ottoman history there. So because of that, I think that's the reason, as the main enemy or the traditional enemy. You certainly see this, not much, but some, in the motivational literature as they're the enemies of honor, is one common sort of theme one encounters. And I think because they expected this, if you have 12 wars with Russia, there might be another one. So Russians made it into such literature more frequently than others. With other enemies, even those manuals or literature published during the war, this is why I said, I didn't see them really updated. I was looking to see if they're going to have something about the British or something about the French. But no, the Russians are there. About the British, nothing, or the French, nothing in the literature, motivational literature, but again, certainly in prisoner of war memoirs. Not so much in other narratives, diaries, or memoirs, except common criticism of the British, nothing sort of dehumanizing or demonizing, is that, how did I put this in my book? It's sort of like, it's about lack of civilization, the Brits' lack of civilization. And I think this is a sort of projection of how the Brits sort of criticize the Ottoman Empire, and somehow that kind of sort of accusation. Sort of
intolerant of other cultures. I mean, Lord Curzon going to Mount Athos.
Sure, yeah.
The dirty, ignorant monks who have all these treasures, and they're crazy, they spend all their days praying, and they have all this great literature.
But in some ways, what I'm trying to say is that,
Yeah.
however the enemy depicted the Ottomans, in some ways, sort of.
It's reversed.
Yes, in reverse. So the Russians did the same thing for the Ottomans, very much in dehumanizing terms. From what I know of some works on Russia. While they're experts here, I shouldn't have said that maybe, but, I can't even think of the authors right now, but certainly Ottomans are sort of represented in that fashion. And as the prisoners walk into sort of Russian soil, they're being transported. They claim that the Russians come up to them and looking for horns and tails, etc., because this is what they expected. So in some ways, prisoners they have a sort of a close connection to civilian Russians, because they see them as helpful, because some people give them bread, water, etc., but they still fear the Russian soldiers who took them captive, and they become dehumanized and demonized.
But that makes sense. They've had so the average person would have more experience with the knowledge of Russia, since there were so many wars with them. Okay, thanks.
Alon?
Yeah, there was another empire too, how did they dehumanize or demonize? That was the Safavid Iran. Because if you look at the Ottoman history, it's mostly the wave towards the west, up to the gates of the Vienna that we see. But they were checked by the Safavids, and Safavids mostly, that was a Shia branch of Islam. Were there what were their relationship with that demonization or dehumanization of the Persians? We do not hear much about how they were checked by the Safavid.
Well, too bad. I guess Aisha is not here, right?
Right.
But so yeah, early modern. I think the main focus was probably the Shiism, but I don't know how the Ottoman, and I don't even know if they did this, to any extent really, except in justifying a war against another Muslim empire.
I can say that where Yemen was concerned, they would, one famous chronicle of the 16th century crushing of the rebellion of the Zaydi Imam, they would take the word Zaydi and change it to Yazid. And so that was certainly demonization. So in that context, it is kind of a Sunni Shiite on the side of the good, on the side of the bad, but here they're kind of flipping the script. And so the Ottomans are the Ahl al-Bayt, the family of the Prophet, and the Zaydis. The Zaydi Imam, who actually claims to be descended from the Prophet, is suddenly the evil Umayyad caliph. So it's...
Because I remember that the Hajis from today's Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, they could not pass through Iran to go to the Hajj. They would come either through Turkey or they would come through Afghanistan and Karachi. So that in between there was the Shia Iran, which were either mistreating or they did not trust or whatever. So this is a history that which we know very little about this.
Yeah, you're right.
Other questions?
I just have a small
I'll join
question
in.
about halal bread.
Okay.
Ordered halal bread.
Yeah.
I understand the word halal, but how this applies to
Oh, well, I mean, as you see, it's my direct translation of things, right? So the idea of eating, I mean, it's not, it's, you know, I could have said halal, right? Eat anything. So the idea of eating some bread of something or somebody is basically the idea of how to put this. It's a,
Like eating the food of an alien?
yeah, right, yeah, Carter, you're gonna.
Isn't the idea here they're trying to tell the soldiers that if they fail in their duty, their bread won't be halal to
Yeah.
them?
That their life, or their existence, basically. So if you're eating haram all the time, you're a pious Muslim.
There's that Ottoman phrase, "Nam nemek borju," a debt of bread and salt. Your sustenance carries moral obligations, and if you fail in your duties, the Lord won't sustain you. That sort of idea, or it won't be halal to you.
That's right. Thank you.
Catalina?
Thank you for this wonderful lecture. Since we've been talking about motivation here, what was your motivation behind bringing these slides about Romania? Shame I haven't seen them.
Because
yet.
I discovered them recently, and I think they're very nice pictures,
And
quality-wise.
do they have a specific place in your research or significance?
No, I was in search of, I just, in fact, I offered this as a possible talk. I just, something on cross-dressing prisoners of war. And I was in search of pictures, men in cross-dress. And I couldn't find any. Then somebody told me, somebody I haven't even met, just email friend, right? Check the Austrian archives from here. Well, it turned out they had a few items online, and one actually showed enlisted men in cross-dress. They're in a circumcision ceremony. I mean, it's quite crude. This is during, it doesn't say where it is. It could be Gallipoli for a line because there's only a house. You can't really tell. But in that collection, I also, just searching around using various German terms, all these pictures, and I thought the quality of them are very, very nice. So I wasn't motivated by anything except good quality pictures. And they're unusual because some of these things are, since they're controlled by the Turkish military archives, same images keep getting circulated, and some of the ones I use are, you can see them everywhere. Just wanted to share some new ones.
Do you know where in Romania this is?
Well, I can easily find out, but I don't remember because they come from different places. But in the collection, in some places, for some places they tell you where they are. Others, like in that cross-dress circumcision, I think they're passing through a village and there's a circumcision celebration. They take a break and suddenly go get woman's clothes from the woman of the village and get dressed in these clothes to entertain both themselves and the children who are sort of looking at them in sort of strange ways. But a good number of them mentioned, though, Galicia, Romania. So the Ottomans, for those of you who know, sent sizable Army Corps units both to the Romanian front and also to the Galician front. And some of them ended up in Russia as prisoners of war.
We've got time for one more question. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I have a very small question, I guess. You mentioned that the officers were concerned that sort of fatalism was going to permeate into other aspects or other spaces in society, and I'm wondering, like, can you comment on how strong the cultural precedent for fatalism as a worldview even was? Like, did this feel radical or new? Or
I'm sorry.
sorry. So, like, I was wondering if you could comment on whether sort of fatalism as a worldview, did that feel new, or was there like a strong cultural precedent for that before the period that you're looking at?
No, I think it existed, or at least this is the fear, right? That this was one of the reasons, not the reason, one of the reasons for the ill fortunes of the empire, or the nation, or the fatherland, in the sense that this is this kind of misunderstanding of religion, taking fatalism or other kinds of beliefs to the extreme. The officers argued that it was a misunderstanding of Islam, and that what they needed was, I'm not going to generalize for all officers here, basically an inqilab or a revolution, but not reformation, of Islam to teach the people anew what their religion was really about. And fatalism was one of those things that bothered them, not perhaps directly so, but as yet another symptom of this idea that peasants in general, not only, same thing in many ways, soldiers that were so much under the spell of, prayer leaders or imams in remote areas by imams who were uneducated in themselves in such notions, and they ended up delivering the wrong message, which undermined the sort of the kind of life they believed that peasants should have, meaning work hard and live for this world rather than the other world. So they thought that kind of fatalism undermined the effort or the work ethic to basically lift themselves up by their own bootstraps, because they believed that if you're, thinking you're going to die anytime, any moment, obviously also taken to the exaggerated limit, then this would somehow undermine the peasants' so what should be natural desire to work for material gain.